serious webinar. My name is Nasanet. I'm the senior researcher for Includovate and the host for this webinar. Today, we will be having a lively discussion on the topic, how are inclusive social services relevant? So for this, to instigate our thoughts, we would be having panelists, 3 panelists. Just before they introduce themselves, I just want to give you a background. Inclusion in social service is perceived familiar, but it's an elusive idea. So in this webinar, we will be trying to understand the concept, the barriers related to inclusive social services, and the benefits of services if they are inclusive. And also, we'll try to touch upon few areas where innovative approaches are bringing changes in making service inclusive. So I would be, before we go to the body of our discussion, I would invite my guests to introduce themselves. Let me start from Christy. Please, Christy, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Net. Thanks very much. So my name is Christina Drizzer. I'm Australian, but I'm currently living in Kampala. I'm the CEO and founder of Includovate, and I'm a political anthropologist, which means that culture, inclusion are very much at the heart of my passion and my interests. And Includovate was started because there is a need to improve the quality of data collected from an inclusive perspective, to make research more inclusive, so different cultures publish and have their voices heard and have the opportunity to represent how their culture and their identity is represented. So that's all from me. I'll hand it over to Sisai to introduce himself.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you, Dr. Nasanet, for inviting me, for making me part of this meeting. And this is webinar. My name is Sisai Mamo. I am an Ethiopian, and I would say about myself as born and designed blind, or like that, I introduce myself in that way. That means I'm having a person with disability. I have been working for Includovate as a disability portfolio lead, and I will continue to work as part of the Includovate family in upcoming months and years, hopefully. And so I'm very privileged. I have a lovely wife called Sosuna. If you look my face, all the beauty comes from her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sisai. Please, Girma.
Hello, thank you, Ms. Adnat. And my name is Girma Hundesa. I'm living in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and I'm a social anthropologist. My background is social anthropology. My research interest is just about governance, state-society relation with respect to access, inclusion, exclusion to resources and social services. So the concept inclusion or exclusion is familiar with me, and I usually approach this concept from governance viewpoint. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate my panelists for introducing yourself. Girma, I am hearing some cracking sound from your audio. I hope it will improve in our next discussion. Let me start giving the first chance to Sisai. I know, Sisai, you are an expert in education and disability program, and what it means inclusive service is in this area, and how relevant to this program it would be. I will give you about 5 minutes to give us highlights on this area.
Thank you. So how inclusive services are relevant. It's a very interesting topic. So I would speak about this from the point of disability. Basically, inclusion comes from diversity. I mean, unless there is diversity, we cannot talk about inclusion, because inclusion is the need to incorporate or accommodate, if you like, all people who have different perspectives, different abilities, different identities, so on and so forth. So, well, so if inclusion comes diversity, then again, we need to talk about how diversity comes. I think it's clear that diversity comes because of difference in needs, difference in needs and in limitations. Like we all are not full, so we all have our own limitations. For example, some of we don't speak the same language, we don't think in the same way. Some of you might be focusing on academically different from some of us. So, you know, difference in every aspect, difference in ability, difference in academics, and of course, like me, difference in body functioning. So taking all this, we can understand that how social services are relevant to accommodate all these different needs and different limitations. Because we live, I mean, we are here to live interdependently, not depending on one another. I mean, to be independent completely or to be dependent totally, but we live interdependently because we do have different limitations and different needs. Though that's why, of course, we talk about inclusive social services, sorry. And that's why we talk about, you know, social services are really relevant when they are implemented in an inclusive manner. When we come to disability, for example, you know, that disability happens as a result of the body functional limitation that can be manifested in physical or sensorial or intellectual or mental, as stated in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we do have, you know, there is a body functional limitation, and there is an environment that fails to accommodate to that limitations. That environment can be a physical environment or a social environment, like in terms of communication, in terms of, because of environmental and social, as well as, of course, biopsychological factors, disability happens. All these limitations accumulate. When the limitations add up into one another, then a person becomes disabled. While he has the ability, he or she will be denied the access to exercise his or her abilities. So when we talk about inclusive social services, then we are demanding, or we are asking social services that can accommodate these, that can treat or that can tackle these disabling factors. So that's why we talk about the relevance of inclusive social service. So I don't want to talk about what social services are, services that constitute a society, like services that enable us to become part of the society. So I don't want to define that. We all know, I guess, I assume that we all know that. But all these services need to be inclusive because the environment sometimes creates barrier. the society sometimes create barrier because of lack of abilities, lack of capacities to accommodate our something or someone who is different from us. So that's why we talk about that make what we call inclusive social service relevant. Plus, inclusive social services make us to talk, to walk our talk. Like, sometimes we demand, we like, if we are inclusive, we always vow to ourselves or we make slogan that we should be inclusive. But, unless we properly design services in a manner that accommodates all differences, all needs, and all diverse limitations and abilities, we cannot say, or we cannot be absolutely sure that we can be inclusive. So it is a way that helps us to walk our talk. I think before my host says time is up, it's better for me to stop here.
Yes, yeah, you just used your time very efficiently. Thank you very much. Definitely we'll be coming back to you with question and answers from the audience as well. Okay, let me go to the next question. It would be Girma. For ordinary people living in poor community like Ethiopia, what are the challenges? What it means an inclusive social service and how it is relevant from your perspective, Girma? So, Girma, now back to you.
So just shall I make a brief summary of the governance as a team state? So governance issue is very important to enable people get services, and it's also a source of exclusion. So I see inclusion, exclusion from governance viewpoint, as I've already mentioned to you, and I see governance from two perspectives. One is legal centralism, and the other is institutional pluralism. And the legal pluralism is the idea that law is controlled by the state, so service delivery is managed and controlled only by the state. On the other hand, legal pluralists argue that law is multiple, is plural, so that service delivery could be possible not only through state provision, but also through state-society relations, through customary laws as well. So in this regard, just many scholars talk how people are excluded from getting access to resources, getting access to services in formalization schemas. And I would like to cite De Soto, who wrote about a mystery of capital. And he argued that in the global south, the control of law by the state is considered as very important, and resources controlled by the community is considered as dead capital, and that requires to be converted to live capital. And this view is actually criticized, and intervention through this formalization schema failed in several places and several contexts. I can take, for example, villagization resettlement program for better service delivery in Ethiopia, which failed because it ignored to consider the consent and the will of the local people at the ground. And also I observed that, for example, in 2016, state-driven land formalization that planned to ensure gender equality, that planned to bring about economic and social inclusion, ended up with failure because it didn't consider local context and that doesn't really consider the view of the local people. So for service delivery, what is important is really working on governance and working on the relationship between state and the society. Some of the perspectives argue that only the capacity of the state institution can enable us to provide better services for the community. On the other hand, other scholars say that no legitimacy of the state, which is to mean that the cohesion between the state and the society that give legitimacy for the state can in return get better services from the state. So society-state relation is very important to bring about inclusive social services on the board. But two views are very dichotomous, and what is really required is to bring them together, that both building an institution of the state, the capacity of the institution of the state, and enabling the state to work together with the local people can help better service delivery like medical care, schools, education, whatever. In wrap up, just for me, when I see service delivery from governance viewpoint, institutional capacity of the state, legitimacy that consolidate socio-political cohesion between the state and the society are important to build a nation state, meaning that good relationship between the society and the state. And in this regard, I would like to cite the World Development Report of 2011 that shows that the state and the society function better when there exists ties of trust and reciprocity and a rich associational life binding citizens and linking citizens to the state. Let me wrap up here.
Thank you very much, Girma, for providing us the inclusiveness from the governance perspective. I here advise those attendees to raise questions to our panelists while we are keeping discussing. I will go to our panelist, Christy. Some of the critical area where inclusion is a problem is gender and social protection. Would you please tell us more on this area, Christy?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think what the other panelists have mentioned is that this idea of social inclusion is complex. It's got a personal aspect that Sisai was saying that, well, there has to be diversity. It's a feeling. It involves walking the talk. And then what Girma was saying about this governance component and the fact that states are the ones who deliver social services, and they often are at the central area and they disperse outwards. And where people, I mean, there's various forms of exclusion. One can be remoteness, one can be Indigenous, one can be illness, for example, ability, language groups. So if you have people, let's say, living on the outskirts or the borderlands of a country, the social services they receive will be less. The resources allocated to those are less. And very often the government will recruit centrally and then move people around to different areas. So in some countries, in some remote areas, where you might have a government official who speaks a different language to the people of that area. Okay, well, that's kind of fair enough, but what does that mean to the people living in that area? Well, it means different things to different people. And this is where social inclusion becomes political. It becomes complicated, but I really want to make the point that it's essential that we learn how to get this right. So cash transfers, social protection, as you mentioned, is often used to reach people who are excluded. or those in need. Let's say they're poor or they have poorer health outcomes. So some cash transfers are connected to school attendance or to immunisation, right? So imagine if you're an Indigenous person living in a borderland, you speak a different language to the government in your area, you're told you will get money from the government if you immunise your child. Okay, but to get your child immunised involves going to a centre that costs you money for transportation. When you get there, you feel excluded, you feel shy, you don't know how to interact with the staff there. They're wearing coats, they're wearing official clothing, there's paperwork, there's forms, and that's enough to deter you. So the cash transfer might be given as an incentive, but it doesn't always solve the problem, because cash is only useful if you can do something useful with it. Getting a health need for your family is only useful to you if you're poor. Short-term thinking is your reality. Look, you often trade long-term security for short-term food security or immediate needs. So investing in immunisation and issues like that, the messaging and awareness raising around such campaigns has to resonate with your cultural worldview. If you're already excluded from government service delivery, from being employed by the government, from understanding health service needs and how to seek behaviour, health-seeking behaviour that's kind of not going to have the healthcare provider discriminate against you more by telling you you're too dirty, you don't speak well enough, your baby's too cold, by blaming you. And let's face it, when it comes to children, it's the mothers who are normally blamed. I'm a mother of 4, completely speaking from experience. Mothers tend to be the ones who are seen as more responsible for their children than men, which in reality isn't true. There's a whole lot of things that go into that assumption. But this is where social inclusion is difficult, because everybody comes at it from a different perspective, from a different understanding of what might work. And as another example, a lot of cash transfers can become conditional on school attendance, which is a good idea in a sense that it's an innocent idea. Let's try and help people whose kids don't go to school get educated, because we all believe in educational outcomes being good for families, being good for poverty reduction, etc., etc. But it fails to think about the way the education services are currently delivered to these groups. So some countries will have a disability allowance, they might have a child grant, they might even have an Indigenous allowance, or they'll have a mother tongue allowance, or they'll have some incentives to get girls to go to school. They might give bicycles or a stipend. And without really understanding the broader environment that incentive is placed within, it can be a disincentive or can further exclude. Just a brief example on the education point. Let's say a son doesn't want to go to school because his mother's poor and he gets teased at school. So the government cash transfer is announced. She goes to register. She's very excited. And then after a while, she doesn't understand that this cash transfer is dependent on her son going to school every day. He stops going to school because he's bullied, or he doesn't have food one day, or he's sick, and that just builds up over time. And then she's cut off on the cash transfer. The school finds out because the school has to tell the state about attendance. And then it just reproduces this attitude of exclusion and not being worthy and being blamed for the current state that that person might be in. And I suppose the gender aspect to me comes out in a lot of the service delivery, because in many countries, the majority of civil servants who are employed by the government are men. Not all, but men. And a lot of frontline service delivery might be women, say in hospitals, but some of them play an administrative role. And just because they're women doesn't mean they understand exclusion any better than men. There are levels and layers to exclusion. For example, a woman who is disabled and physically disabled and a widow living in a remote area is less likely to access services than an able-bodied man living close to town. So all of those different attributes that that woman has further exclude her. So overcoming that is not going to be a quick fix. It's not going to be done just through a service delivery. You have to overcome a lot of the attitudes and discrimination that has been inbuilt into the society and the way government services are delivered. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Christy. I think you have touched upon very interesting areas, education and gender areas. It's really sometimes amazing to see when you open your eyes and look around, and when you go back to the tracks that you have gone through your life, you start to realize that how things are not inclusive. As you mentioned, from my background, I can speak of the health system. So starting from developing the curriculum, it's not designed in a such way that it is inclusive, and the practice that's being provided at health facility level has really quite a lot of gaps. So it's all about just opening your eyes and try to look into and see and understand and try to find a solution for that. Let me go to my next question. I think I'm seeing a question coming from one of our participants. I think he said, I think sometimes inclusion from governance point of view mainly, but can also be from access to service perspective, can be politicized. It can be interpreted as political security challenges. How can such a thing be addressed? I feel this question directly goes to Girma. I hope while Girma is synthesizing answer for this question, I would be going to Sisai, and I would like Sisai, you give us some feedback on what are the barriers for inclusive social service and what consequence it has if services are not inclusive.
So now there are,
Girma, are you starting? I invited Sisai, and I would like to come back to you while we are preparing for the answer for the question raised. Sisai,
you've asked me about what are the barriers for social inclusion and what?
And the consequence if
the consequence of exclusion.
Yes.
I think some of the barriers, some of the points have already been raised by my friends, by Christy and by Girma as well. Particularly, Christy was raising some of the barriers, and it depends. I mean, as Christy was rightly saying, socially inclusion is a very complicated aspect. So when you talk about barriers, from which angle are you talking about? There are barriers when you talk about from gender perspective. There are barriers when you talk about from disability perspective. And there are barriers from, like, when you talk about from remotely or those who live around remote areas. Or there are barriers when you talk about from economically poor or underdeveloped perspective. So from which angle is a question. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But in general, I would say the first, the most noteworthy key barrier is attitude, attitudinal barrier. I mean, in attitude, like it looks like, you know, a package. I mean, it looks like a kind of a ship that harbors many things. Mm-hmm. So in attitude, there is superiority complex, for example. In attitude, there is a consideration that someone is less than me. Like this is the superiority feeling is one part of attitude. Neglect is another part of attitude. I mean, if I grow for myself, if I develop for myself, why do I care about others? That's one aspect of attitude. So sometimes in attitude there are biases, ignorance because of lack of knowledge, because of lack of understanding. Attitude is shaped. Sometimes people unintentionally believe, for example, many people unintentionally believe that people with disabilities are less capable. I mean, they unknowingly, I mean, they mean it truly. I mean, it's not because that they want to be superior, but because they don't know that people with disabilities can't do many things, they assume that people with disabilities are lesser than them, or they're less capable. So sometimes attitude is nurtured by lack of knowledge, by ignorance. So the first key barrier is, of course, attitude. Resource is another barrier. Economic resource, I mean, resource to provide many things, that's another barrier. Of course, knowledge is another barrier, lack of knowledge. I mean, because you know how to address people. For example, sometimes you might have a belief, you might have a conviction that you would address the special needs of people with disabilities, or with like the address of women, or the address of people who are in the remote areas. But unless you know how to do that, unless you know how to address those people, how to address the needs through knowledge, that's also lack of, that's also a barrier. So if I speak about barriers like this, knowledge barrier, resource barrier, and of course the very key barrier, attitudinal barrier, let me speak about the consequence. We talk about, for example, Ethiopia. Ethiopia is underdeveloped. Ethiopian economy is underdeveloped. One of the consequences, I totally believe that this is because Ethiopia is not yet inclusive. Ethiopia is not making its all people to be included. We talk about, for example, World Bank and World Health Organization estimate that 17.6% of the Ethiopian population have some kind of disability. On the one hand, we have this estimation, and on the other hand, we talk about wastage of products in agriculture, for example. Assume that many farmers might have invisible disabilities. Some of them might have, for example, visual impairment. And when they make a harvest, they might not properly do the harvesting process, you know? In terms of gender, I mean, we can speak a lot of consequences. People, because of their imposition, because of the imposition upon them, because of the barriers upon them, they would not be effectively engaged in the production. So the very consequence of exclusion is poverty. I mean, we can be rich, we can get economic success when we become inclusive enough. We cannot do, even if sometimes we might succeed by the work of some people, those who are the few, but unless you exclude unless you include the majority, we cannot be, the sustainability of that growth will be in doubt, you see. So the very consequence of exclusion is, I believe, poverty. And of course, the abuse of human rights. Sometimes, in many cases in Ethiopia, I mean, let me take Ethiopia because Ethiopia is my country and the country that I grew up and I worked more. So, I mean, we talk about political equality, but we talk about mostly about political equality without ensuring the inclusion of minorities, the inclusion of women, the inclusion of people with disabilities, the inclusion of pastoralists, the inclusion of different group of people, the inclusion of different people with different language background, with those who live in remote areas, those who are considered quote unquote as minorities. So sometimes it's funny when we talk about political equality without talking about inclusion. So inclusion is, as I said before, inclusion is a practical way to bring down inequality. You know, it's not because we make a demonstration, we make strike that things become improved. It's when we include practically, when we ensure the inclusion of people that we make sure equality is realized. I think let me give time for others to speak on other questions.
Thank you, Sister. Thank you very much. Girma, would you please address the question from our audience?
Perfect. Yeah. As I already mentioned, exclusion, inclusion are on the continuum, or on the two extreme continuum. So inclusion is partly a goal and partly it is a process. So we do have access in between the two. Someone who gain access to resources, to knowledge, education, technologies can be easily included. And those who are not, those who are excluded from those things could not be beneficiary of the system. And one of the mechanism of exclusion is law. It could be the state law, state governance system. It could be force, which is in relation to security. It could be resource. It could be legitimacy. Whatever it is, my concern is here, as the question was already raised, is that security can be one mechanism of exclusion, and the security is believed to be maintained by the state, particularly according to the institutional perspective approach. We do have institutional perspective and legitimate perspective, and the institutionalist focus on the idea that the state is the one who maintains security, and maintaining the security enables individual to gain better life, to get better services from the state. That would also bring about economic development, peaceful existence for the society, and the like. So the convention is that we do have a strong state. Strong state can maintain peace and security so that service delivery could be easily possible. We do have conventionally weak state, particularly many states in the global south are categorized under weak state because they lack partly legitimacy, they partly lack institutional capacity to enforce the law and the policies. And we also find, insecurity because of various conflicts in this part of the world. We do have also fragile state. In fragile state, where conflict is a common practice, you do not as such expect citizens gain access to better services. We find many people get excluded from benefiting from the services. I can take, for example, Ethiopia as a best example. Over the last 2 months, war has been going on in the northern part of Ethiopia. Because of this, there is internet blackout in that part of the country. Because of this, internet blackout just disable people to get access to money from the bank to communicate with their family who are living in other part of the world. They are not benefiting from their own resources because of the communication disconnection. So security has its own role, really paramount role, to affect access and inclusion of services.
Thank you very much, Girma, for touching upon for the question that was raised by our audience. Let me go to Christy. For the time's sake, I would be trying to touch upon some questions which we have to address to our audiences. What are the benefits of having inclusive service, Christy? And can you give us a specific approach, innovative approach that tells this approach is innovative, just from your experience?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing, picking on what Girma said, is the spectrum. And it's not like full inclusion may be the only way to get to inclusion. There are different ways to go about it. It needs to be seen as a process or an outcome, not just an outcome and not just a process. So very often people think of the state being exclusive, and how do you change that to being inclusive? And the comments in the chat that it can lead to backlash, further conflict, etc., are a very real risk and a very real threat, and they need to be planned for and discussed. So certain mechanisms can be put in place. And I think what part of that, those mechanisms, needs to be an acknowledgement around the pace of change. You can't just suddenly put a whole lot of people who don't read or write into Parliament, for example, because they've been excluded, and expect them to pass laws. And then, you know, great, we've got an inclusive state. It's a lot more than just numbers, bringing people together. But sometimes starting with the numbers is a way to give people role models. All of a sudden, someone from their group can be a parliamentarian, and all the kids are now saying, I want to be a parliamentarian from that particular group. So it's not like I'll do A, B, and C, and then I'm going to expect D, E, F. It is, I'm going to try A and see what happens, see how that goes. I'm going to have a discussion, and I'm going to have mechanisms in place to discuss this when politics, which is inevitable, will happen, because inclusion is about politics. It's about power relations. Some people have the power, some people don't. And that is reinforced in social interactions. It's reinforced in our institutions. And that won't be overcome in one day. So some of those mechanisms, I suppose, would be around, like I mentioned, the quotas, to have certain groups represented. They would also need additional assistance to understand the language and the process that they're included in. If that's not there, some of the backlash can be pointing the finger that group's the problem because that representative didn't say this or couldn't do that, therefore we shouldn't include them. So you have to be aware that it's almost like one step forward and two steps back. And that's what I mean when I say the pace of change. It really is about an experience, learning how to work with people who are very different to you, that challenge your fundamental identity of what makes you who you are. Sisai was talking about a superiority complex. Now, yes, but gee whiz, admitting that is a really big thing to have to do, especially publicly. So I often say in the work we do that I would love politicians to talk to children with disabilities, because that would be monumental in terms of role modeling and inclusion. Even if they weren't going to school, even if they didn't have equal healthcare, it would still be something. But politicians won't do that because it'll make them look weak, because they do not know how to communicate with a child with Down syndrome. They do not know what to do if a child holds onto their hand and hugs them and doesn't let go. So this is where it's personally very confronting, social inclusion. Some of the other, so it's a practice, is I guess what I'm trying to say. It's a practice in both ways. Those who have had the power and those who haven't equally need to do the work. It's not just one group that has to do the work. Some of the, another mechanism is around like social accountability tools. So these can be like downward accountability. They're governance mechanisms to help states incorporate the views of different citizens into service delivery. Instruments such as citizen scorecards or citizen charters, which are like publish that the rights of citizens in accessing this service are A, B, C, D. They will not be charged a fee. They will have this, they will have that. Sometimes just publishing that can lead to change, because the person who's now going in to get that service for the first time in their life is aware of the rights, their entitlements, and the type of service they should get. They may not that first time raise that issue. They may not say, I saw that board out there that you don't charge me, so why am I paying? That may come the second visit or the third visit. but the mechanisms should be put in place to facilitate that change, that bringing together, and acknowledging, like I said, that it's not just one-sided. It really is about identity, shaping, changing, growing together in a pace that is not going to cause disharmony. It's not going to cause further conflict. And I think that's where it gets tricky, very, very tricky. For another example, the military, they have this idea of collateral damage, which is you can drop a bomb, some people will die, but the benefit is you win the overall war. A few lives are lost, but that's the way it is. Now, that's not social inclusion. We're actually rallying against that idea, which is fundamental in war and peace, and how we understand the nature of engagement. So when Ban Ki-moon said we're going to leave no one behind in the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals, boy, I mean, we don't know how to do that yet. We fundamentally have to change our institutions, the way we program, the way we develop policies, the way we understand ourselves and our identity to get there. So it's not going to happen overnight. Thank you.
I really appreciate for that. We have one question coming up from our audience. I feel this would go to Sisai. It says, what is the relationship between social and digital inclusion? Can they to be integrated from perspectives of digital inclusion? What would be your say, Sisai, on this question?
Thank you. I think it's a very good question. What is the relationship between digital and social inclusion?
Yeah.
So we are doing this social inclusion webinar using the digital technology, of course. You know. So technology is coming as a good friend, sometimes as a bad friend, unless managed properly, to cut the high divide, you know. For example, take the COVID-19 effect. COVID-19 would have cut every one of us at home because every government is making a lockdown declaration. So everyone will be kept at home, no work, nothing at all. But this technology, this digital technology has cut back this divide, and we are all connected. And of course, we have learned from that, and we are all now in our home to participate in this. Maybe Mr. Girma looks in office, I guess, but many of us, I think, are in our homes, but doing office work, you see. So this digital technology has brought an immense solutions, shortcut solutions, if you like, to those barriers, to environmental barriers, to communication barriers that are created. For example, now take I am blind. I am now, but I'm expressing myself. I'm doing every communication using this digital technology. So they have a lot of relationship. Of course, one way to ensure social inclusion is to make sure that the technology become inclusive. The technology has brought a lot of solutions where man cannot reach, people cannot reach. So it's really a good solution, a good, like, you know, medicine, if you like, for the ill society who cannot communicate each other, who cannot. Sometimes we're hearing even let's take even Stephen Hawking, for example, the late Stephen Hawking, who uses artificial voice, digital voice, if you like, for his ability. So digital technology is a means of ensuring ability. It creates enabling environments for people who otherwise would have been denied of their access, of course, because of the different barriers. Christy was talking about war. Many factors create a damage upon, one of, for example, the destructive effect of war is that it brings damage upon people. It denies people's ability if you become wounded. But that will not be the end of the world as long as we are using technology. So that's why we're talking much about the digital technology inclusion. It's a means to an end, a means that lead for the creation of a socially inclusive world. That's what Facebook is doing, what that social medias are doing. People now are sharing ideas through this mechanism. Otherwise, their ideas would have been with them, cannot come out. But now ideas are moving without visas. I mean, ideas from Australia, ideas from Ethiopia, ideas from everyone is, coming in, and where the world is becoming so small due to the digital technology. So they're closely related, these two, social inclusion and digital inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sisay. I appreciate really for having answering this question relating to your experiences and your livelihood. There is a question also coming from our audiences. How can we promote social inclusion within exclusive policy processes? I think this is more of going to Girma. Girma, can you please address this question?
Yes, I mean, inclusion, as I've already mentioned, is one thing, but we need also to consider access and exclusion is there. So we can think of inclusion not only from policy angle, from the state law perspective. State law is one mechanism that allows access to benefit from services and other things. We do have other mechanisms of getting access or inclusion, like, for example, using forces, market, resources, legitimation. We do have so many other criteria. So thinking from only from binary viewpoint, inclusion versus exclusion doesn't help. Even I'm reading another question here. How can we think of inclusion in an exclusionary policy? If the state policy, for example, is an exclusionary one, can we bring about inclusion? Yes, because state policy is only one mechanism of access. We do have another mechanism of access. As Sisay repeatedly mentioned, building ability of the agent, building ability of the individual, the group could help them to be able to access a certain services. So inclusion is not to be seen only from the law angle. We do have multiple variables that enable people benefit from the system.
Thank you very much. I think for the time's sake, I would be raising the last question, maybe for Christy. What are your prediction for the trends in inclusive social service? How do you see the future?
Thank you. Yeah, the future of inclusive social services, I think, will involve pairing government service delivery with civil society support. So if you think of the state being one instrument of those with power, those who have the dominant discourse, those who shape policy already, doesn't matter, as I mentioned before, how good intentioned you may be, you still subscribe to certain biases that are unconscious, that you're not aware of, that can unwittingly exclude certain populations. So what we need to do is make sure those populations who are excluded get additional support so that they can benefit equally from those services. This involves thinking about sustainability. Sissa and I did an evaluation together on children with disabilities being educated. And there was this, let's teach teachers how to understand sign language or different mechanisms to be able to include children with disabilities. Excellent government solution. Then the funding stopped. Eventually, the teachers moved area or resigned or whatever else happened. There was no pipeline to keep teaching these teachers how to teach children with disabilities. And therefore, the children got used to having a service and then it was taken away. And I think we need to be aware of the responsibility in working in this space, not to do harm. We don't want to be giving, a golden chalice or a solution that's not affordable and not sustainable. And the government isn't going to be able to do this for everyone everywhere. In poor countries, the government doesn't have enough money. And given what Gurma was saying about state-society relationships, there's a need for this sort of bottom-up approach or this outside the government civil society, education, groups, that sort of thing that gives support to people who might be excluded to help them troubleshoot with like-minded or feeling that something else is on their side or on their team. And it's not about us or them, it's about confidence. It's about experimenting with being included. And it's not a given that all of a sudden you're going to know how to act when you go into a government office. Someone needs to do something in that space to make that work better. So to wrap up, the two things I would say about inclusive social services: one, a need to understand sustainability and the responsibility that goes with working in this space, and the need for governments to acknowledge that they can't do it all, and also civil society can't do it all. There needs to be a coming together and working together, and acknowledgement that it takes time. Thank you.
I appreciate very much. Thank you, our panelists. We'll be winding up our today webinar. It is really very interesting discussions that we had. Inclusiveness comes from diversity, and for making inclusive services is all about equity among diversity. There are quite a lot of points that you raised. I hope you enjoyed our time together in this thought series till we meet on our next thought series. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.